The morning sun cast long shadows across the Pacific as Admiral Chester William Nimitz stood on the bridge of his flagship, studying intelligence reports that would change the course of the war. It was May 28, 1942, and the Japanese Imperial Navy was planning something massive. The intercepted communications, decoded by Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor, painted a terrifying picture. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was assembling the largest naval armada in Pacific history, targeting a mysterious location designated only as AF. Commander Joseph John Rockford, the brilliant cryptanalyst leading the code-breaking efforts, had been working tirelessly for weeks. His team of dedicated sailors and civilians hunched over their machines in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters, breaking Japanese naval codes with methodical precision. The breakthrough came when they confirmed that AF was indeed Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii. Yamamoto's strategy was audacious in its scope. The architect of Pearl Harbor sought to draw the remaining American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle where his superior numbers would crush American naval power once and for all. His plan called for a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands to draw American forces north, while his main striking force would capture Midway and establish a forward base threatening Hawaii itself. The Japanese admiral commanded a force that seemed unstoppable. For heavy aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu formed the spearhead of his first air fleet under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. These floating fortresses carried over 250 experienced pilots who had honed their skills in China and perfected their tactics at Pearl Harbor. Supporting them were the battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, along with transport ships carrying 5,000 troops for the invasion. Behind this striking force followed an even more formidable fleet. Yamamoto himself commanded the main body from his flagship Yamato, the world's largest battleship. 7 battleships, 1 light carrier, 3 cruisers, and 21 destroyers formed the second wave, ready to annihilate any American forces that might appear. Nimitz faced an impossible decision. His intelligence was extraordinary, but his forces were pitifully small compared to the Japanese armada. The American Pacific Fleet had been crippled at Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier. He could muster only 3 carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, which had limped back from the Coral Sea battle with critical damage that would normally require months of repairs. The weight of command pressed heavily on Nimitz's shoulders as he contemplated the odds. According to historical accounts from the Naval War College archives, he told his staff, "We will have to take calculated risks and hope that our superior intelligence and the fighting spirit of our men can overcome their numerical advantage." As May drew to a close, both fleets began their deadly dance across the Pacific. Yamamoto's forces moved eastward for Japan in multiple task forces, while Nimitz positioned his smaller fleet in the most advantageous position possible. The American admiral knew that surprise and timing would be his only advantages in the coming battle. The stage was set for what would become one of the most decisive naval battles in history, where the fate of the Pacific War and perhaps the entire conflict would be determined in the span of a few crucial hours over a remote coral atoll. Task Force 16 steamed northwestward through heavy seas on June 1, 1942, as Rear Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance contemplated the monumental responsibility thrust upon him. Originally, Vice Admiral William Frederick Halsey was to lead this crucial mission, but a severe case of dermatitis had hospitalized the legendary Bull Halsey just days before the operation. Now Spruance, a methodical and brilliant tactician, commanded the carriers Enterprise and Hornet along with their escort vessels. Behind them, sailing separately, came Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher aboard the scarred Yorktown. The carrier bore fresh wounds from the Battle of the Coral Sea, her flight deck patched with wooden planks and her hull plates still showing scorch marks from Japanese bombs. Pearl Harbor shipyard workers had performed miracles, completing repairs estimated to take 3 months in just 72 hours. The American pilots preparing for battle represented a mixture of seasoned veterans and green recruits. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's air group, had trained his dive bomber squadrons relentlessly, knowing their accuracy would be crucial in the coming engagement. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander John Charles Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8 aboard Hornet prepared for what they knew would likely be a suicide mission: torpedo attacks against heavily defended Japanese carriers. As the American task forces moved toward their destiny, Nagumo's striking force approached Midway from the northwest. The Japanese admiral felt confident in his mission's success. His pilots were the cream of the Imperial Navy, veterans of campaigns from Pearl Harbor to the Dutch East Indies. The fur carriers under his command had never tasted defeat, and their aircraft had dominated every sky they had entered. On Midway itself, the small garrison prepared for the onslaught they knew was coming. Colonel Harold David Shannon commanded the Marine Defenders, while Lieutenant Colonel James Patrick Sweeney led the Marine Air Units. Their mixed collection of obsolete Brewster Buffaloes, ancient Vindicator dive bombers, and a handful of newer aircraft represented the atoll's primary defense. According to wartime reports from the Marine Corps' Historical Division, the defenders worked frantically to prepare their positions, digging trenches and positioning anti-aircraft guns, while knowing full well that their survival depended entirely on the American fleet intercepting the Japanese before the invasion could begin. The morning of June 3rd brought the first contact, a Navy PBY Catalina flying boat, piloted by Lieutenant Howard 80, spotted the Japanese transport group 600 miles southwest of Midway. His radio crackled with a historic message, many ships bearing to 60 degrees. Distant 700 miles from Midway, the battle had begun. That evening, flying fortresses from Midway launched the war's first attack against Yamamoto's forces. But their high-altitude bombing runs against the moving transport ships proved ineffective. The Japanese continued their approach, seemingly unstoppable. As darkness fell on June 3rd, both sides made final preparations. Fletcher positioned his task forces northeast of Midway, hoping to catch the Japanese carriers by surprise after they launched their attack on the atoll. Nagumo maintained radio silence, his powerful force cutting through the Pacific swells toward what he believed would be an easy victory. In the pre-dawn hours of June 4th, Japanese flight deck crews began the familiar routine of preparing their aircraft for launch. Bomb carts rolled across the steel decks as mechanics made final adjustments to engines and weapon systems. The rising sun flags painted on fuselages seemed to glow in the artificial light as pilots gathered for their final briefings. Aboard the American carriers, similar scenes played out under different circumstances. The American pilots knew they were outnumbered and outgunned, but they also knew that surprise might be their salvation. As the eastern sky began to lighten on June 4th, 1942, both fleets prepared for a battle that would determine the course of the Pacific War. The first light of dawn on June 4th, 1942, illuminated the crystal-clear waters surrounding Midway Atoll as Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo ordered the launch of his first strike. At 4:30 in the morning, flight deck crews aboard Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu began the synchronized ballet of launching 108 aircraft toward the distant American base. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led the aerial armada, his Kate torpedo bomber loaded with an 800-pound bomb instead of its usual anti-ship torpedo. Behind him flew 36 Nakajima Kate bombers, 36 Aichi Val dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters, their engines creating a thunderous symphony as they climbed toward their cruising altitude and set course for Midway. At 5:20 that morning, Radar Station 1 on Eastern Island detected the incoming formation at 93 miles distance. The warning sirens began their mournful wail across both Eastern and San Islands, as every available fighter scrambled to meet the approaching threat. Major Floyd Blue Parks led 25 Marine fighters into the morning sky, a mixed collection of obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and a handful of newer Wildcats that represented Midway's entire interceptor force. The aerial battle that followed demonstrated the vast gulf in experience and equipment between the opposing forces. The Japanese Zeros, piloted by veterans with hundreds of combat hours, systematically destroyed the American defenders. Within minutes, 15 Marine fighters were shot down, their pilots either dead or parachuting into the lagoon below. Major Parks himself fell during the savage melee, his Buffalo no match for the superior Japanese aircraft. Despite the defenders' courage, Tominaga's bombers pressed home their attack with devastating precision. High explosive bombs tore through the powerhouse on Eastern Island, while incendiaries set fuel storage tanks ablaze, sending towering columns of black smoke into the tropical sky. Yet the crucial airfield remained operational, and most of the American aircraft had already launched toward the Japanese fleet. As reported in post-war interrogations documented by the Naval War College, Tominaga radioed back to Nagumo at 7 o'clock, "There is need for a second attack." This message would prove crucial to the day's outcome, for it convinced the Japanese admiral that Midway's defenses remained formidable. While Nagumo pondered this assessment, waves of American aircraft from Midway began their desperate attacks on his carriers. At 7:10, Major Lofton Russell Henderson led 16 Marine dive bombers toward the Japanese fleet, followed by high-flying Army flying fortresses and torpedo-carrying marauders. The attacks came in uncoordinated waves, exactly as Japanese doctrine preferred. The experienced Japanese Combat Air Patrol, led by seasoned pilots like Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, intercepted each attacking group with devastating effectiveness. Henderson fell during his dive bombing attack on the Hiryu, his aircraft exploding in midair as Zero fighters converged on the vulnerable American bombers. The Army bombers, attacking from 20,000 feet, scored no hits despite dropping dozens of bombs at the maneuvering carriers. Most tragic was the fate of Torpedo Squadron 8's detachment of 6 Avengers. These new aircraft, making their combat debut, approached the Japanese fleet at wave top level while Zeros dove on them, like hawks attacking sparrows. Within minutes, 5 of the 6 Avengers were burning wrecks scattered across the Pacific's surface. Only Ensign Albert Kyle Ernest survived, his aircraft so badly damaged that it crash-landed on Midway with his gunner dead and his radio man wounded. By 8:30, Nagumo faced a crucial decision. His first strike had been successful, but not decisive, and Tominaga was requesting a second attack. More troubling, American land-based aircraft had demonstrated their ability to find and attack his fleet, even if their coordination and effectiveness left much to be desired. The Japanese admiral made the fateful decision to prepare his reserve aircraft for a second strike against Midway, rather than keeping them armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for anti-ship operations. Across this for carriers, ordnance crews began the laborious process of switching weapons loads, removing torpedoes and replacing them with high-explosive bombs designed to destroy land installations. This seemingly routine decision would prove to be one of the most consequential moments in naval history. As the morning sun climbed higher over the Pacific battlefield, both sides remained unaware that the most decisive phase of the battle was about to begin, initiated by the arrival of Admiral Fletcher's carrier-based aircraft that were even now approaching from the northeast. At 9:20 on the morning of June 4th, the Japanese carriers presented a scene of organized chaos that would soon transform into catastrophe. Across the flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, ordnance crews worked frantically to rearm aircraft for the planned second strike against Midway. Torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs lay scattered across the hangar decks, replaced by high-explosive bombs and incendiaries intended for land targets. Vice Admiral Nagumo's dilemma deepened when, at 7:28, the cruiser Tone's reconnaissance aircraft finally reported the presence of American surface ships to the northeast. The delayed launch of this crucial scout plane originally scheduled for pre-dawn departure represented one of those minor mechanical failures that altered the course of history. For over 2 hours, the Japanese striking force had operated without knowledge of the American fleet's location. The sighting report initially mentioned only 10 ships, but at 8:20, the scout pilot added the electrifying detail: enemy appears to be accompanied by a carrier. Nagumo now faced an agonizing choice between completing the rearming for a second Midway strike, or immediately switching back to anti-ship weapons to engage the American carriers. Meanwhile, Admiral Fletcher aboard Yorktown had been tracking the Japanese attack on Midway through radio, intercepts, and radar reports. At 6 o'clock, he had ordered Spruance's Task Force 16 to proceed southwestward and attack the enemy carriers, while he recovered his own combat air patrol and scout planes. By 7 o'clock, both Enterprise and Hornet were launching their strike groups into the crystalline morning air. The American attack developed in scattered waves that seemed destined for failure. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet became separated from their fighter escort and dive bomber companions in the towering cumulus clouds that dotted the morning sky. Following his instincts rather than the planned course, Waldron led his 15 Devastator torpedo bombers directly toward the Japanese carriers. What followed became one of the most heroic and tragic episodes in naval aviation history. Waldron's squadron approached the Japanese fleet at 8 altitude, their obsolete aircraft struggling to maintain formation as Zeros dove from above. Like avenging angels, one by one, the Devastators fell into the sea, their crews trapped in aircraft that had become flying coffins. According to combat reports preserved in the National Archives, Waldron radioed his final message as his aircraft began its death dive: "Watch those fighters. See that splash? That was a fighter." Within minutes, all 15 torpedo bombers were destroyed, with only Ensign George Horace surviving by clinging to a seat cushion in the oil-slicked water below. Similar fates awaited the torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Elbert Lindsay's torpedo squadron 6 lost 10 of 14 aircraft, while Lieutenant Commander Lance Edward Massey's torpedo squadron 3 from Yorktown suffered equal devastation by 1020. The Japanese had shot down 37 of 41 American torpedo bombers without suffering a single hit in return. Admiral Nagumo might have felt justified in his confidence, as he watched the American attacks fail so completely. His carriers had emerged unscathed from nearly 3 hours of continuous assault, while American aircraft fell like autumn leaves around his formation. The Japanese combat air patrol had performed magnificently, and his own aircraft were nearly ready for a devastating counterstrike against the American carriers. But the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons had achieved something that crews would never know. The low-level attacks had drawn the Japanese fighters down to wave-top altitude, leaving the high-altitude approaches undefended. More critically, the Japanese carriers had been forced to maneuver violently to avoid torpedoes, disrupting their formations and leaving them scattered across miles of ocean. At exactly 10:22, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bombers from Enterprise emerged from the cloud layer at 14,000 feet to find the Japanese carriers spread below them like a tactical exercise diagram. McCluskey had been flying for over an hour, his fuel gauges showing dangerously low levels, when he spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing northward to rejoin the main formation. Following that white wake led McCluskey to the most important target identification in naval history. Spread before his 33 dive bombers lay 3 of Japan's for carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, their flight decks crowded with aircraft, fuel lines snaking across steel plates, and ordnance scattered throughout. They had become floating bombs waiting for a spark. McCluskey pushed over into his dive at 10:24, followed by his squadron leaders Lieutenant Richard Halsey Best and Lieutenant Wilmer Earl Gallagher. The moment that would reshape the Pacific War had arrived, though none of the participants could have imagined the magnitude of what was about to unfold. In the clear morning sky above the Central Pacific, the dive began at 10:24 on June 4, 1942, as Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey pushed his Douglas Dauntless into a 70-degree dive toward the Japanese carrier Kaga. Behind him, 32 more dive bombers plummeted earthward like steel hawks, their perforated dive brakes screaming in the tropical air. As they accelerated toward their targets below, Lieutenant Commander Richard Halsey Best, leading Bombing Squadron 6, made a split-second decision that demonstrated the tactical brilliance American naval aviators could achieve under pressure. Seeing McCluskey's entire group diving on Kaga, Best pulled his section away and selected the flagship Akagi as his target. This instantaneous decision meant that two Japanese carriers would face simultaneous attack, instead of concentrating all bombs on a single target. At 14,000 feet, the Japanese carriers appeared as toy models against the blue Pacific canvas. Their flight decks, crowded with aircraft being prepared for launch, gleamed white in the morning sun. Fuel lines stretched across the steel plates like deadly snakes, while ordnance carts loaded with bombs and torpedoes dotted the deck spaces. The ships themselves were maneuvering desperately, their captains having finally spotted the American dive bombers beginning their deadly descent. The first bomb struck at precisely 10:26. McCluskey's pilots, despite their limited combat experience, demonstrated the accuracy their intensive training had developed. Multiple thousand-pound bombs crashed through Kaga's flight deck, detonating in the hangar spaces below, where aircraft and aviation gasoline created an inferno that turned the mighty carrier into a floating volcano. Simultaneously, Best's small section attacked Akagi with devastating precision. Lieutenant Best himself scored a direct hit just after the carrier's island superstructure, his bomb penetrating the flight deck and exploding among aircraft being armed for the next strike. Within seconds, Admiral Nagumo's flagship transformed from a symbol of Japanese naval power into a blazing wreck that would never again launch aircraft. As documented in post-war Japanese accounts preserved by the Naval History and Heritage Command, Captain Taijiro Aoki of the Kaga described the scene. The ship became a floating hell. Explosions followed explosions, and flames spread everywhere. Similar destruction engulfed Akagi, forcing Admiral Nagumo and his staff to abandon their flagship and transfer to the light cruiser Nagara. But the American onslaught was not finished. At almost the same moment, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Franklin Leslie's dive bombers from Yorktown emerged from a different cloud bank and spotted the carrier Soryu. Leslie had lost his own bomb due to an electrical malfunction, but his squadron pressed home their attack with the same deadly precision demonstrated by their Enterprise counterparts. Within minutes, Three of Japan's finest carriers, veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Dutch East Indies, and the Indian Ocean, were burning wrecks that would never again threaten Allied shipping. The fourth carrier, Hiryu, had been separated from her sister ships during the morning's maneuvering and escaped the devastating attack. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding the second carrier division from Hiryu's bridge, immediately ordered a counter-strike against the American fleet. His remaining aircraft, 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters, represented the last offensive capability of the once mighty Japanese striking force. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led this desperate mission toward the American carriers, guided by the towering smoke column rising from the burning Japanese ships behind him. At 11:55, his aircraft found Task Force 17 and immediately attacked the carrier Yorktown, flagship of Admiral Fletcher. The Japanese attack, though small in numbers, demonstrated the skill and determination that had made their naval aviation so formidable. 3 bombs struck Yorktown, penetrating her flight deck and starting fires in the interior compartments. The carrier's damage control parties fought desperately to contain the blazes, while maintaining enough speed to continue flight operations. By noon on June 4th, the tactical situation had been completely reversed. 3 Japanese carriers burned helplessly, while their escorting destroyers attempted rescue operations. Hiryu remained operational, but isolated, facing 3 American carriers with depleted aircraft reserves. The morning that had begun with Japanese confidence in easy victory had transformed into a disaster of unprecedented proportions. Yet the battle was far from over. Admiral Yamaguchi aboard Hiryu was preparing another strike with his remaining torpedo bombers, while Admiral Spruance contemplated how best to exploit his stunning tactical advantage. The afternoon would bring more desperate attacks, more burning ships, and the final confirmation that the tide of the Pacific War had irrevocably turned in favor of the United States. As the tropical sun reached its zenith over the Pacific battlefield, both sides prepared for the final acts of what was already becoming recognized as one of history's most decisive naval engagements. The afternoon sun beat mercilessly down on the burning hulks of the Japanese carriers as Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi prepared his final desperate gambit aboard the Hiryu, the last operational Japanese carrier in the striking force. Hiryu had escaped the morning's catastrophe only through fortunate separation from her sister ships. Now she stood alone against 3 American carriers, her flight deck crews working frantically to prepare every remaining aircraft for what they knew would be a suicide mission. At 1 o'clock on June 4th, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, the same pilot who had led the dawn attack on Midway, climbed into his Cape torpedo bomber for the last time. His aircraft had been damaged during the morning mission, its fuel tank punctured by American anti-aircraft fire, but the veteran pilot insisted on leading the final attack, despite knowing his aircraft lacked sufficient fuel for a return flight. Behind Tomonaga, 9 more Cape torpedo bombers and 6 Zero fighters prepared for launch. This pitifully small force represented all that remained of the aviation might that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months. As the engines roared to life and the aircraft began their takeoff rolls, everyone aboard Hiryu understood they were witnessing the death throes of Japanese naval aviation's golden age. The American task force, commanded by Admiral Fletcher from his damaged flagship Yorktown, detected the incoming Japanese strike at long range. Combat air patrols scrambled to intercept while the 3 carriers turned into the wind to launch additional fighters. The Yorktown, despite her earlier damage, continued operating aircraft with the typical resilience of American damage control techniques. At 2:45, Tomonaga's depleted squadron found the American fleet and immediately concentrated their attack on Yorktown. The Japanese pilots, knowing this was their final mission, pressed home their attacks with fanatical determination. The torpedoes struck the carrier on her port side, causing massive flooding and bringing her to a dead stop in the water. According to wartime damage reports preserved in the Naval Archives, Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered abandoned ship as Yorktown began listing heavily to port. The great carrier, veteran of the Coral Sea and now Midway, appeared to be sinking as her crew took to life rafts and surrounding destroyers moved in for rescue operations. Meanwhile, American search planes had finally located the elusive Hiryu. At 3 o'clock, Lieutenant Samuel Adams launched from Enterprise with 24 dive bombers, determined to eliminate the last Japanese carrier before she could launch another strike. The flight to target took nearly 2 hours, during which Hiryu's deck crews prepared their final 10 aircraft dive bombers, this time for one last desperate attack. The race between Japanese preparation and American arrival would determine whether Hiryu could launch her remaining aircraft. or would join her sister ships in fiery destruction. At 5 o'clock, Adams's dive bombers arrived over the Japanese carrier just as her final strike was preparing for takeoff. The attack on Hiryu demonstrated the same deadly precision that had characterized the morning's strikes. For direct bomb hits transformed Japan's last carrier into another floating inferno, her flight deck buckling under the explosions while aviation gasoline fed roaring fires throughout her hull. The dive bombers that might have attacked the American fleet instead burned where they sat, their pilots trapped in the holocaust that consumed their ship. Admiral Yamaguchi, one of Japan's most capable naval commanders, chose to go down with his ship rather than face the shame of defeat. As documented in post-war Japanese accounts, he sent a final message to Admiral Yamamoto: "We have done our best. We are preparing to ram enemy carriers." The ramming attack never materialized as Hiryu's engines failed and she began her death roll. In the darkening Pacific, by evening on June 4th, all four Japanese carriers were burning wrecks scattered across hundreds of square miles of ocean. The strike force that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months had been effectively eliminated in a single day. Japanese naval aviation, built painstakingly over the decades and perfected in the crucible of combat, had suffered losses from which it would never recover. Yet Admiral Yamamoto, commanding the main body with 7 battleships and numerous escort vessels, still hoped to salvage something from the disaster. His powerful surface force could potentially engage the Americans in a night battle, where Japanese superiority in night fighting techniques might prevail. As darkness fell over the Pacific battlefield, both sides contemplated their next moves in what had already become one of history's most decisive naval engagements. The strategic implications of the day's fighting were already becoming clear to perceptive observers on both sides. Japan had lost not just for carriers, but the irreplaceable pilots and aircrew who had made those ships so effective. The road to Tokyo, previously defended by a seemingly impenetrable barrier of naval aviation, was now open to American advance. As darkness enveloped the Pacific battlefield on June 4th, 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto faced the most agonizing decision of his distinguished naval career. The architect of Pearl Harbor, commanding his massive fleet from the bridge of the super battleship Yamato, received increasingly desperate reports from his scattered task forces. For fleet carriers destroyed, hundreds of irreplaceable pilots dead, and the entire strategic foundation of Japan's Pacific defense shattered in a single day, Admiral Raymond Spruance, now commanding the American striking force after Admiral Fletcher's transfer from the damaged Yorktown, demonstrated the tactical wisdom that would make him one of America's greatest naval commanders. Despite pressure from subordinates to pursue the retreating Japanese fleet for a night engagement, Spruance recognized that his victory was already complete and chose not to risk his precious carriers in the darkness where Japanese superiority in night fighting could reverse the day's achievements. The night of June 4th to 5th witnessed one of the most tragic episodes of the entire battle. The destroyer Tanakaze, attempting to rejoin the main Japanese force, encountered the crippled carrier Hiryu still floating but abandoned. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi and Captain Tomio Kaku had chosen to remain aboard their doomed ship, sending final messages to their families and emperor before the carrier finally slipped beneath the waves at 9:10 on the morning of June 5th. Meanwhile, the supposedly sinking Yorktown proved American damage control capabilities by refusing to die. Throughout the night, salvage parties worked desperately to save the great carrier while the destroyer Hammond came alongside to provide power and pumping capacity. By dawn, Yorktown was riding more evenly in the water, and hopes grew that she might be saved despite her grievous wounds. Yamamoto's final gambit came in the pre-dawn hours of June 5th, when he attempted to lure the American fleet westward into range of his battleships and remaining aircraft from the light carrier Hosho. The Japanese admiral broadcast false position reports and moved his surface forces eastward, hoping to catch the Americans in a decisive surface engagement where his superior numbers might prevail. But Spruance refused to be drawn into the trap. The American admiral, guided by the same intelligence network that had made the victory possible, recognized Yamamoto's deception and maintained his position northeast of Midway. As reported in post-war strategic analyses by the Naval War College, Spruance later explained, "I had gained the victory. Why should I risk losing it by chasing shadows in the darkness?" The morning of June 5th brought both triumph and tragedy for the American forces. While search planes confirmed that the Japanese fleet was retreating westward, the submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, penetrated the destroyer screen around the salvage operations on Yorktown. At 1:36 in the afternoon, for torpedoes struck both the carrier and the destroyer Hammond, sinking the destroyer immediately and delivering the death blow to the valiant Yorktown, as documented in survivor accounts collected by the Naval History and Heritage Command. The great carrier rolled over and sank at dawn on June 7th, taking with her the battle honors earned at Coral Sea and Midway. Her loss represented the final casualty of the great battle, a reminder that victory in naval warfare always comes at a price. The strategic implications of the Battle of Midway became apparent in the weeks and months that followed. Japan had lost for fleet carriers, a heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and over 3,000 sailors and aviators. More critically, the core of Japan's trained naval aviation pilots, whose skills had been honed through years of combat, was gone forever. American losses, while painful, included only one carrier, a destroyer, 147 aircraft, and 307 personnel. Admiral Yamamoto, returning to Japan aboard his flagship, reportedly told his staff, "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant." The offensive capability that had carried Japanese forces across the Pacific to the gates of Australia and India was broken. From Midway forward, Japan would fight a defensive war against an increasingly powerful American industrial and military machine. The battle's conclusion marked the beginning of the end for Japanese hopes of Pacific domination. Within months, American forces would land at Guadalcanal, beginning the long advance toward Tokyo Bay. The carriers that burned at Midway would be replaced by scores of new American ships, while Japan struggled desperately to rebuild her shattered naval aviation. On June 6, 1942, as the last survivors were pulled from the Pacific waters, both sides began to comprehend the magnitude of what had occurred. In for days of fighting around a tiny coral atoll, the balance of Pacific power had shifted irrevocably toward the United States. The Battle of Midway, won by intelligence, courage, and a measure of fortune, had indeed shaped the war's direction and pointed the way toward ultimate Allied victory.